I will pass it to you, Mary. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie. My name is Mary Robinson, and I am a CARES mentor with the Alliance, and I'm happy to be here tonight and excited for this conversation we're going to have about equity in education for our LGBTQIA2S plus students. And so I'm glad that you all got to be here to be a part of this. I'd like to start this evening by respectfully acknowledging the Indigenous people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. And I live on the traditional lands of the Wenatchee or the Pisquotia people. And I would love for you to pop into the chat if you'd like to and tell us the traditional lands that you are living on out of respect as well. And tonight, our main presenter is going to be Kasia Rosetta with the OSPI Washington Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and we're really glad she's here. Also on this slide, you can see the names of many other partners that are here this evening too, and they will pop in during the Q&A if your question has something that they're suited to give us a great answer to. And we're just really glad that they would all spend their evening this way and be willing to invest and educate us and partner with us and to help us as we're in this journey and to bring a lot of clarity to the work that we're doing, especially in this kind of sensitive topic. And it's a great opportunity for us. So with that, Kasia, we would love for you to jump in and get started. And thank you so much for being here.
But of course, it is my honor. Let me make sure. We want to not share that screen. We want to share, hold on one moment. Beginning, and let's go out. All right, so hopefully you can just see the big slide now. Is that right? Perfect. Okay. Well, everybody, thank you for spending your evening, or at least part of it, with me and the rest of the group. My name is Kasia Rosetta, and I am one of the program attorneys in the Equity and Civil Rights Office at OSPI. And tonight we are here to chat about the legal protections that exist for transgender students in Washington public schools and to talk about creating gender inclusive schools and maintaining them, and then also what to do if things don't go the way that we hope they will. So what to do if there is a concern, a question, a complaint, a problem that you need to be addressing with school administrators, school and district administrators. So before we start though, just a couple logistics. The handout and slide deck were actually not emailed out earlier today, my mistake. They will be sent out after the presentation. So you will get copies of both our handout and then a PDF of the slide deck to keep. We are asking that you save your questions until the end for the live Q&A. That way we can have more of a conversation. And then finally, our office at OSPI, we are a neutral source of information. So we answer questions and provide technical assistance to educators, to districts, to social workers, to counselors, community members, you name it, but we're not allowed to provide legal advice. So as we're talking tonight, if you have a super fact-specific question, I might ask you to either connect with me offline or just say, oh, that's one that I can't unfortunately answer for you because I'm kind of veering into that realm of providing legal advice, which I'm not allowed to do, unfortunately. So before we get started, just a couple foundational pieces. If you're not familiar with our office, so OSPI is our state education agency. The Equity and Civil Rights is a small office within that agency, and all of our work centers around civil rights laws as they apply specifically to K-12 education. Our primary goals really are to promote awareness of rights and responsibilities under state and federal civil rights laws, and to provide districts and families and communities and people who provide wraparound services to students all of the support that they need to ensure that every student in our state has equal access to a public education without discrimination. So just a high-level overview of Washington's K-12 public school system. So we have 295 school districts. We have 16 charter schools. We're up 2 from last year. 8 tribal compact schools, 9 ESDs supporting all of those schools, and just under 1.1 million students at last count. With that background in mind, we have 3 learning objectives for our time together tonight, and our time together tonight is pretty limited, right? I think we have between 25 and 30 minutes for the actual content, and then about the same amount of time for questions. Normally, our presentation on gender inclusive schools runs about 90 minutes, so I've really tried to distill things down into what I think will be most useful for you in your role, in your various roles, I should say. So we're going to talk briefly about something called developing gender literacy, or developing a working vocabulary and kind of comfort level to use when talking about gender, as well as familiarity with other key legal terms that are commonly misunderstood, but are really important to understand if you're helping to advocate for a student. We'll go through the federal and state legal protections that exist to protect transgender students from discrimination based on both gender identity and gender expression in Washington public schools. And then we're going to wrap up by clarifying the different dispute resolution options that exist if a trans student is experiencing discrimination or bullying or harassment based on gender identity or expression at school. So we're going to dive in. And before we do that, though, I think I failed to introduce myself. So I just want to tell you a little bit about my background in like 2 sentences. So I've been at OSPI for about 7 years now, which is wild. Before that, I was an attorney in private practice. And before that, I was a middle school teacher. I taught English and various other subjects at an independent school in Seattle. And one of my former teaching colleagues is actually in the audience tonight. So I'm very excited to connect with her again. All right. Key terms. So again, our goal here is to figure out what terms are important to know. And this is a really good time to acknowledge that everybody here is probably on a different place on like the vocabulary learning curve and comfort level. And that's okay. Terminology and the way that we think and talk about gender is constantly shifting and evolving. And in many situations, there isn't actually universal agreement about some of these definitions, but there are kind of a few frequently used terms that we want to make sure that we're aligned on for purposes of our conversation tonight. So we're starting just with the giant acronym, and I noticed that yours is actually even longer than the one we use at OSPI. We all probably know what this means, right? It's this acronym that combines elements of sexual orientation and gender identity, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, ally, and then the plus sign, right, that holds space for any additional identities that evolve. It's kind of an imperfect acronym because it combines those elements of gender identity and sexual orientation, which aren't the same thing. But it's what has stuck and it's what we are familiar with. So it's what we're using today. We are going to be focusing on the T, and we're looking at the T for transgender as truly an umbrella term to include anyone whose gender identity does not align with their sex assigned at birth. So we kind of call these the big 4 key terms that it's important for people working with students and in the school systems to understand. And I'm not going to date myself here, but I just wanted to acknowledge that unlike many people of my age or older, students that we work with are part of this generation that probably already looks at gender as more nuanced than just a simple binary, right? Where you're either male or you're female, right? Our students are living in this world where gender diversity is really not a new concept. They've seen it, they've heard about it, not only in their own families and peer groups, but also on social media and popular culture, all of that. So we're going to start with the premise that gender is about more than the type of body that somebody has, but it's instead this complex relationship between bodies, outward expression, internal identity, right? And each of these aspects of gender can be thought of or viewed on a spectrum. So that's why we have the arrows on the slide, which is really just to denote that, you know, there aren't fixed points. There might be, but there don't have to, you know, it doesn't have to be like that. And it just kind of as a thought exercise, as we're going through these terms, it might be kind of fun to think about where you'd locate yourself on the male-female continuum that we have up here. So let's dig in. Assigned sex is just the sex that we were all given at birth, usually based on the appearance of our bodies. And historically, that has fallen into one of two categories, right? Male and female, although some states and countries do offer a third option. Washington is one of those states since 2018 or 19. I think we've had a third option on our birth certificates. Gender expression can be most easily thought of as our public gender. So thinking about how we present our gender in the world and how we are perceived, how our gender is perceived by others in that world. And often we think of things like behaviors and emotions and mannerisms and your style of dress and your hairstyle, makeup, all of this stuff, highly gendered, right? When it comes to the way that we're portraying our gender or the way that gender is perceived, there are often patterns, but not necessarily hard and fast rules. Okay, so it's important to remember that these patterns can change over time and vary by culture. So just as an example of something that's changed over time, right now in our country, if we were to say, what color is pink? Is that a feminine or a masculine color? Most people would probably say that it's a feminine color. But back up 200 years, and the exact opposite was true. Pink was actually masculine color. Blue was a feminine color. And so things can change over time. They can vary by culture, right? Today in the United States, we don't often see very many men wearing skirts, right? But in other countries and places, Indonesia, Fiji, Somaliland, Scotland, right? Men wearing skirts is not unusual. And I actually learned that it is a required component of men's military attire in Albania and Greece. So there's your fact for dinner tonight. So again, patterns but not rules, things can change over time and vary by culture. Gender identity is the next one. And if we have public gender in our gender expression, gender identity is our private gender. So it's how we perceive ourselves to be. It's an individual, deeply held, like internal sense of ourselves as masculine or feminine, or a blend of both, neither, right? Really important point is that we all have a gender identity, right? It's often assumed that someone's gender identity is going to align with their assigned sex, and in many cases it does, but it might not, right? And we can't know someone's gender identity just by looking at them, right? Again, it's also not static. It can change over time, right? Particularly as people gain access to kind of a broader world and a broader vocabulary, right? The most frequently used adjectives to describe gender identity include cisgender, which is where your gender identity matches your assigned sex. Most people are cisgender. Transgender, where your gender identity doesn't match your assigned sex. And then non-binary, where a person's gender identity doesn't fall into one of the two traditional binary categories. So maybe that person identifies as something other than male or female, or not entirely male, not entirely female, or blends elements of both. Okay, so those are three common adjectives. The last term is sexual orientation, and we've given that a purple arrow just to denote that it's not the same thing as gender identity, but it's instead this collection of terms that we use to describe who we are attracted to, whether it's emotionally, physically, romantically. So terms like lesbian and gay and straight and bisexual, asexual, queer, all of that. And cisgender, transgender, and non-binary people can all have any different sexual orientation, right? So you could be a gay trans man, you could be a straight cis woman, you could be a bisexual non-binary person, right? So these are all adjectives that we use. And as a former English teacher, I feel compelled to share with you the correct usage of these terms, which is as adjectives, right? We would never say a transgender as a noun, right? Or a transgendered, right? I have heard that, but we want to use those as adjectives. And here I've used my dog's names as the examples down here, even though, their gender identities are up for grabs at this point, but those are just to illustrate the points. Okay, so those are the big four. The next thing I just want to touch upon is this idea of gender inclusive schools. Like what do we mean when we're talking about that? And we could mean any number of things, but primarily they are places where discrimination based on gender identity and expression is prohibited. And this is bolded because this is actually the law, like it's not optional, like this is what you're supposed to be doing, what schools are supposed to be like. But they're more than that, right? They're places where students' gender identities are respected, they're affirmed, they're supported. They are places where gender stereotypes are challenged so that all students can feel free to express their interests, right? And find confidence in their strengths, regardless of how outside society has gendered different things. So thinking about a boy or a non-binary person who wants to take a dance class or is interested in early childhood education, which are traditionally fields more dominated by women, or a girl or a non-binary person who wants to play a contact sport like wrestling or football, who is interested in becoming a neurosurgeon, right? These are challenging gender stereotypes. So these are places where these challenges are encouraged. And then finally, there are places where natural human difference and variations can be talked about and discussed without judgment. And they're really important. And there are like infinite reasons why they're important. But the first reason, we're only going to touch on a couple today. The first reason is because we know through research that when schools are gender inclusive, all students are able to feel more authentically seen and valued, more comfortable, right? Connected. This idea of school connectedness, which is a really important protective factor in terms of helping kids be able to resist negative behaviors, negative habits. So they benefit and validate all students. And this one is really important, particularly for our transgender students. These types of schools help to equalize student experiences and outcomes. So historically, school has not always been a safe place and still isn't for many students who don't conform to gender norms or who are transgender, right? And we know that transgender students experience many more negative outcomes and experiences at school than their cisgender peers. So just as an example, transgender students are 2 to 3 times more likely to experience discrimination and harassment based on gender identity and expression at school, 2 to 3 times more likely to report mental health challenges like suicidality and depression and anxiety. And a really sobering statistic, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, which is that between 30 to 50% of our transgender youth report having attempted suicide. We know that the more contexts, home, school, work, peer groups, in which transgender students experience gender affirming support, the less they experience these types of negative outcomes, particularly depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation and behavior. Okay, so bottom line is that gender inclusive schools are excellent for all students, but particularly protective for our trans students who are more vulnerable. Okay. We are going to be talking a bit about discrimination, so I want to make sure we're on the same page about the legal definition of discrimination. A lot of times we hear people saying, I've been discriminated against, when what they really mean is that they've been unfairly treated. But the key to discrimination, legally speaking, is that that unfair treatment has to be based on your membership in a protected class. So what's a protected class? Great question. A protected class is a group of people who share common characteristics and who are protected from discrimination under the law. So in Washington, we have a really robust set of civil rights laws. We have 13 different protected classes. They're listed for you here. You can see that sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression are specifically called out, not the case in all of our states. Okay, so in Washington, we're very lucky. The other term that I want to make sure that we are familiar with is discriminatory harassment. Okay, so discriminatory harassment is a type of bullying. It's a type of bullying that pushes into the world of discrimination because it's conduct or communication that is based on or motivated by protected class. So there's that key, protected class, and creates what's called a hostile environment for students. This is interesting. It doesn't have to include an intent to harm, and it doesn't have to be directed at a specific target or at an individual student. So these are common misunderstandings. Now, discriminatory harassment absolutely can include an intent to harm, and it absolutely can be directed at a specific student, and it most often is, but doesn't have to be. So if a school's investigating an incident of alleged discriminatory harassment and the alleged perpetrator says something like, well, they're just being sensitive, or, I didn't mean for them to take it that way, that doesn't matter. That does not preclude the school from finding that the discriminatory harassment occurred. Intent is not an element. Okay, so that's just something that I think is important to point out, because that's often a defense, right? And that might be a mitigating factor if you're thinking about what type of discipline, right? But it's not an element in whether or not the school finds the conduct happened. And then it doesn't have to be directed at a specific target. A student can be impacted by witnessing or just existing in a climate that is hostile to LGBTQ students, right? Where jokes or bullying or other conduct communication like that is based on protected class, and they just know it's there and they just don't feel safe, right? So you don't have to be the actual target. You can be impacted even if you're not the one, that's being directly targeted. So just to kind of illustrate what this idea means based on or motivated by a protected class, whole range of behaviors, right? There's not a limited definition. This is just a sampling. Last year, we took calls in our office relating to quite a few incidents of anti-LGBTQ harassment, including pride flags being pulled down from displays in school, in one case, a pride flag being lit on fire. We had flyers that were hung in a high school bathroom saying that LGBTQ people spread disease. There's been a whole lot of anti-trans rhetoric happening at school board meetings and in communities across our state. And there has been physical assault of transgender students. So these are just a sampling of things that our office has dealt with this year. So just to show you the whole kind of range of conduct. And I think someone who's doing dishes may not be muted at the moment. Did anyone else hear that?
We got it. They're muted now.
Awesome. Perfect.
Sorry about that.
No, not a problem. I just wanted to make sure in case they, All right. So this, in addition to this whole protected class thing, the conduct also has to create a hostile environment. So that's the second element, which means the conduct has to be so severe, persistent, or pervasive that it essentially impacts the student's ability to participate in or benefit from the school programs or activities. Okay. So those are our definitions, and that was a lot of information, but it is important to kind of set the stage so we understand what we're talking about for this next part. So the next part is just talking about the federal and state laws that exist to protect our trans students from discrimination. Okay, so federal law, there actually isn't one. There isn't a federal law that explicitly prohibits discrimination in our schools based on gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation, for that matter. Now, some courts have held that Title IX, which is the federal civil rights statute that prohibits sex discrimination in schools, some courts have held that that extends to cover sexual orientation, gender expression, gender identity, and some courts have held that the Equal Protection Clause implicitly provides those protections, but not all courts, okay? There's also some protection that's been provided recently by Supreme Court case law and by agency guidance. So there was a case in the US Supreme Court in 2020 called Bostock versus Clayton County, a Georgia case, where the statute at issue is actually an employment non-discrimination statute that basically says you can't fire people because of their race, color, national origin, religion, or sex. And the court was asked whether an employer could fire somebody for being gay or transgender. So does firing somebody under that statute constitute sex discrimination? And in this monumental decision, authored by Justice Gorsuch, of all people, the court held that it does. So Gorsuch wrote that the answer was clear, that an employer who fires somebody for being gay or transgender fires that person for traits or for actions it would not have questioned in members of a different sex. So sex plays this necessary and undisguisable role in the decision, which is exactly what the statute forbids. The reason why this is important is you might be thinking, like, why are we talking about an employment discrimination statute? We're talking about schools. And the reason is because Title IX is an educational statute, and courts decide Title IX cases in the same way they decide Title VII cases historically. So if a Title IX case were to be brought before the Supreme Court, odds are, hopefully, although you never know, that they would decide similarly and hold that Title IX also encompasses other types of discrimination besides just sex discrimination. In light of Bostock, the Department of Education issued some guidance saying that they intend to interpret Title IX in that same way. So, hey, in light of Bostock, just, sex discrimination based on gender identity and expression is prohibited as sex discrimination. We're going to interpret the Title IX in the same way. So we have the support of this Department of Ed at this moment in time. All right, but we're in Washington, and we are lucky. We have not one, but 2 state laws that prohibit discrimination explicitly on those protected classes. One that's applicable to schools as places of public accommodation, and one that is applicable specifically to public schools. That's the law that our office enforces. And we have, of course, regulations and guidelines, which we're revising right now. And we have our Gender Inclusive Schools webpage, which I do want to click on just to show you that it exists, because this is where you're going to find the most up-to-date guidance and information from our office. So if we click on this, it will take you to our Gender Inclusive Schools webpage, where we have all the laws and guidance. We have drop-down menus where you can learn more about different topics like names and pronouns and gender designations and locker rooms and bathrooms and all of that stuff. We also have our longer webinar and our training handout and a bunch of other resources. So I wanted to point that out for you so that you knew where it was. So all of this to say, what's the rule in Washington? The golden rule in Washington is that in public schools, all of our students have the right to be treated in accordance with their gender identity. So whether you are cisgender, transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, everybody, right? Everybody has the right to exist in a space that is safe for them at school based on gender identity and expression. As for what that looks like, okay? First of all, I just want to point out that almost all the questions that you have about the protections for trans students can be answered by just thinking about this rule, okay? Bathroom use, well, transgender boy, treated in accordance with their gender identity, they should be able to use the boys' bathroom if that's what they want to do. Okay, so it means using students' requested names and pronouns and gender designations at school without needing to prove it and have legal documentation. There is one exception to that, which is the transcript. The transcript still has to have a student's legal name on it, and that's because that's just how the RCW, the law, is written. But even transcripts have a spot for other names. Okay, but in general, we're using students' requested names in almost all other contexts at school, whether it's on attendance lists, sports rosters, yearbooks, ID cards, all of that. It's allowing students to use sex-segregated spaces like locker rooms and restrooms that in ways that align with their gender identity. It's not requiring documentation to verify someone's gender identity. It's keeping information about a student's gender identity or transgender status private, and it's respecting students' rights to self-identify, okay? If you are working with a student who wants to socially transition at school, one option, not required, is to consider working with the school to develop what we call a gender support plan. And we have a template for this. It's not our document. It's created by Gender Spectrum. And I'll give you a link to it at the end. But it's basically this living document that the student and like a family member, if they want to invite the family member in, and somebody at the school, they sit down, they talk about all these different aspects of school, like confidentiality, parent-guardian involvement, sports, bathrooms, names, pronouns, and they just kind of walk through it and make sure that everyone's on the same page. Living document can be amended, can be revised, can be ripped up and thrown away, right? But it's a good way to kind of structure the conversation, particularly with students who may know that they want to socially transition, but maybe haven't thought like 3 to 4 steps ahead, like, hey, if I socially transition, that's going to increase the odds that my family is going to find out, right? Or that, the more publicly I'm living this way, right, people are going to know, and that's fine. But we just want students to make decisions with eyes wide open and to make informed decisions about their own selves and their own self-identification. So this can help people kind of think about things. So that's optional. And those are the legal protections. So what happens if things go south, right? We all want to believe that our districts are creating these amazing gender inclusive school environments. We know that that's not always true, even despite people's best intentions. So what do we do? What are our options if things aren't going well? Well, as we know, this is the law, right? You can't discriminate and you can't harass somebody based on gender identity and expression. We know that students have the right to be treated in accordance with gender identity and gender expression. So if you have a question, concern, or complaint, one of the first things you can do is review your district policies and procedures. As of 2020, districts are required to have a policy and procedure that addresses the supports needed by transgender students. In most districts, I've given you the policy and procedure numbers that are applicable in most districts, although not all. But there's a gender inclusive schools policy and procedure, and then there's your non-discrimination policy and complaint procedure. And these are the ones you're going to follow if you want to go down a dispute resolution path, and also just kind of educate yourself about what rights students have. There's also somebody in each district who has the responsibility of being the point person for all of the concerns and questions and complaints that come to the district about this. That person is called the Gender Inclusive Schools Coordinator, and your district or school should know who that person is, and they should be available by email or phone to talk with you or meet with you in order to discuss your concerns. Finally, there's always the option to file a written complaint using one of the processes that's outlined. We have a handout that we've designed for parents and students, and essentially it's going to walk people through the definitions and then explain step by step how to file a complaint using the process our office oversees, which starts with a complaint to the school. They have an opportunity to investigate and issue a written decision, which then the person has an opportunity to appeal. The school board usually decides on appeal, and then if you're still dissatisfied, you file with our office, and that walks you through the steps for each of these. There's also a few other organizations at the end of this that are listed that also accept discrimination complaints, so we've given contact information for those there. And then finally, you can always contact our office. We exist, it's one of our primary purposes is to share information and resources and what the law says. So please feel free to reach out to us at our primary email address or phone number. I've also included some additional resources here at the back. So when you get this PDF, you'll have access. The gender support plan is found in Appendix D of the Schools in Transition Guide, just to kind of clue you in there. And that's it. And I went 5 minutes over, which for me is pretty tight. So I am going to stop the share so that I can hopefully see those of you who choose to appear, and we can open it up for the Q&A comments. If you're noticing trends in schools that you want to share, that's also great. But I'm mostly interested in answering your questions and having a conversation. And thank you for listening.
Great. So I'm going to stop the recording.